Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the final days of Jesus. Much of what we're going to be discussing in this series has leaned heavily from a book by the same title, authored by Andreas J. Kostenberger and Justin Taylor. Now, this is a fantastic book, and it's worth your time to purchase and to read, as it's going to go into much greater detail about the topics that we're going to discuss in this series. It's important before we begin also to discuss our other source material for which we're going to be using for the rest of the week to explore the final days of Jesus, the Bible, specifically the four Gospels. These are found at the beginning of the New Testament. We see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they contain eyewitness accounts and firsthand reports of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels are reliable sources of information for many factors. The first one being that Matthew and John, the authors of the first and fourth Gospels, were members of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Now, John was even part of Jesus' inner circle, and their records are trustworthy because they were on-site eyewitnesses of the accounts detailed in their writing. Now, Mark, the author of the second gospel, the church fathers tell us wrote his gospel in close association with the apostle Peter, which was also one of the 12 disciples, and he was a member of Jesus' inner circle, as well as a prominent spokesman of the 12. Last, we see Luke. Now, he himself was not an eyewitness. However, he sought to conduct a very careful investigation of these events. And in his writing, he even acknowledges his dependence on those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And you see this in the first chapter, verse 2 of his book. It is in these writings of these qualified authors where we get our source material for as we discuss the final days of Jesus. We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to our study, The Final Days of Jesus. Today we're going to talk about what happened on Palm Sunday, which was 5 days before the death of Jesus on the cross and 7 days before his resurrection from the grave. It's Sunday, March 29th, AD 33. The Passover crowds that have flocked to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover holiday, as well as residents in Jerusalem, are buzzing with this messianic expectation. And Jesus doesn't disappoint. Now, Jesus is fresh off of his miracle of resurrecting Lazarus from the dead. And I got to tell you, the entire region was buzzing about this 30-something-year-old rabbi that had done this. And many are asking the question because of this, was he the Messiah? And others, they've already made up their mind that he is. But others, mostly the religious leaders of the area, they're skeptical at best and even hostile at worst. On that Sunday morning, Jesus and his disciples are on the Mount of Olives as they approach Jerusalem. Jesus sends two of his followers off to the nearby village of Bethany or Bethphage, and he tells them to get a colt for him to sit on as he enters into Jerusalem. Now, this is a big deal because in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, we see a prophecy proclaimed, and it says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Everybody knew what he was doing. This is such a big deal. This is not a passing coincidence that it directly relates to this prophecy in Zechariah. You see, what Jesus is doing here is he is intentionally fulfilling this prophecy so that he can clearly communicate to everybody that sees him do this his kingship. Everybody in Jerusalem will know what he's doing. And it works. Jesus makes his way down the Mount of Olives and toward the holy city, and the crowds, they get his message loud and clear. They respond by taking their robes and also laying palm branches on the path where he's entering into the city. They kind of create this king's red carpet for him. And they do more than that. They proclaim him as their king and their Messiah. In Matthew 21, verse 9, it says, "And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest.'" The crowds roared in their proclamation of Jesus as king. There was no mistake. Now, they're doing this instead of proclaiming Caesar as king, which is a big deal, and we'll get to later in this series. What happens next is recorded in Matthew chapter 21, verses 10 through 11. It says, "And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowd said, 'This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee.'" The city is shaken by these events, and it leads some of the Jewish leadership to ask Jesus to rebuke the crowds. Jesus refused to do that. Recorded in Luke chapter 19, verse 41, Jesus responds by saying, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." Now, it would be really, really, really hard here to overestimate the volatility that these events are going to create in the political climate of Jerusalem, not to even mention the religious climate of Jerusalem. Jesus was openly challenging the religious establishment by proclaiming himself as their promised Messiah. And this is an open challenge to Caesar as they call him their king. Up to this point, it would have been possible for Jesus to live a long, happy, peaceful life. But these events, they set into motion a series of events that could only end in two possible ways. The first outcome could be that Jesus would overthrow the Roman leadership and rule of Jerusalem, and he would also incite a revolution over the religious leadership of Israel. Or the second outcome would be Jesus' brutal, public, painful, and humiliating death. Jesus has crossed a line. He's crossed the point of no return here. With this entrance into Jerusalem and this proclamation, there's no turning back now. Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44, they record Jesus' response after all this happens. It's in verse 41, it says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, 'Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes, for the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation.'" He wept for the holy city. He cried because he knew he wasn't there to overthrow the Roman rule or the religious establishment as they viewed it. He was there to die. And he would die at the cheers of the same people that on that very morning had been yelling, "Hosanna," would in 5 short days be yelling, "Crucify him." Next, in John chapter 12, we see that Jesus predicts his own death. You see, some pilgrims were in Jerusalem for the Passover festival, and they seek an audience with Jesus. The book of John doesn't record the Greeks' questions to Jesus, but Jesus responds by predicting his own death. And he also describes it as the very purpose for which he's come into the world. Verse 27 says, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour." And then right after he says this, a voice like sounds of thunder affirms what Jesus has said and proclaims that in Jesus' death, God's actually going to glorify his own name. And it's as if Jesus sees the astonishment of the people around him and mouths are gaping open or something, because I guess he feels like he needs to go further and clarify some of this stuff that's just happened after Jesus says this and this thundering voice from heaven comes down. Verse 32 says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." And then in verse 31, he proclaims this action of his death is going to deal a crushing blow to Satan. Now is the judgment. In verse 31, it says, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out." And of course, the crowd doesn't like hearing that their proclaimed Messiah is going to die. What they hear, they don't like, because they object to it, saying that the Mosaic law claims that the messianic rule and leader must remain forever. So they can't make this all work in their minds. And so Jesus, he doesn't directly answer their objection, but he commands them to walk in the light while they have the light. It's almost as if Jesus knew that what they asked would be revealed to them later and didn't want to spoil it, possibly. So why would he say walk in the light as they have the light? It wasn't long before this that Jesus, in the book of John tells us Jesus proclaimed himself as the light of the world. He does this in chapter 8, verse 12, as well as chapter 9, verse 5. And so he's almost like, just wait and see. Just stay with me and you'll get what's going on here. Or after this, Jesus and his disciples, they're kind of getting ready to leave Jerusalem. But before they head back to Bethany, at the end of the day, Jesus makes a quick stop into the temple. And it's as if Jesus hasn't done enough to upset the religious establishment. Jesus walks into the temple and he begins to perform miracles. He heals the blind and the lame, and he receives this praise and adoration of children. Now, this initial visit to the temple, this is going to set the stage for the extraordinary events that are going to happen tomorrow that we're going to, in Jesus' life, that we're going to actually discuss and open up tomorrow. These are the events that took place Sunday, March 29th, AD 33, in the final days of Jesus. Find us on Facebook and YouTube tomorrow evening and discover what happens next in the final days of Jesus.